Number 1. Chester Dwayne Turner. Chester Dwayne Turner's crimes unfolded quietly across South Los Angeles for more than a decade, largely unnoticed as a single series, even as women continued to turn up dead in streets, alleyways, and abandoned spaces between 1987 and 1998. The victims were strangled, their deaths often categorized as isolated incidents tied to street violence, substance abuse, or unstable living conditions rather than part of a coordinated pattern. Many of the women lived on the margins of society as sex workers or unhoused individuals, which meant their cases rarely generated sustained public attention or pressure on investigators. Each homicide was handled separately, spread across different precincts and time periods, allowing the same offender to keep moving through the same neighborhoods without raising alarms. Turner lived a transient lifestyle, drifting between temporary housing, shelters, and the streets, making him difficult to track and easy to overlook. He did not stand out in any obvious way, held no steady job, and left behind little physical or social footprint that investigators could easily follow. For years, there were no reliable witnesses and no consistent suspect descriptions linking the crimes together. As a result, the murders accumulated quietly in police files, while Turner continued offending. The turning point did not come from a tip, a confession, or a surveillance breakthrough, but from evidence that had been collected years earlier and preserved. In 1998, Turner was arrested in connection with the murder of a pregnant woman, a case that finally placed him directly in police custody. Biological evidence recovered from that crime scene was carefully retained, and as forensic science advanced, investigators began re-examining unsolved murders from the same areas and timeframes. When Turner's DNA profile was entered into California's expanding database, it produced a series of matches that fundamentally changed the scope of the investigation. Murders once thought unrelated suddenly aligned, revealing a consistent pattern of victims, locations, and method that pointed back to the same individual. What had appeared to be random violence was now clearly the work of a single serial offender. As prosecutors built their case, DNA evidence linked Turner to 10 murders committed over an 11-year span, each connection reinforcing the reliability of the forensic findings. The trial focused heavily on scientific evidence rather than eyewitness testimony, reflecting how little traditional investigative material existed after so many years had passed. In April 2007, Turner was convicted of 10 counts of first-degree murder, and the jury sentenced him to death. At the time, the conviction already marked one of the most significant serial murder prosecutions in Los Angeles history, but the case continued to evolve even after sentencing. Additional DNA testing conducted years later connected Turner to 4 more killings, increasing the confirmed victim count to 14, including 1 unborn child. Each new identification highlighted how long Turner had been able to operate without detection and how many opportunities for intervention had been missed. The case also drew attention to earlier investigative failures, including instances where other individuals had been suspected or even charged while Turner remained free. Ultimately, the Turner investigation became a defining example of how advances in forensic science can resurrect cold cases and expose long-hidden patterns of violence, while also underscoring how vulnerable populations can be overlooked within the criminal justice system. Today, Chester Dwayne Turner remains on death row, his conviction standing as a stark reminder of how easily a serial offender can disappear into the background when crimes are fragmented, under-prioritized, and separated by time, and how decades later, preserved evidence can still bring accountability when every other lead has gone cold. Number 2. Phil Spector. Phil Spector was one of the most influential figures in modern music long before his name became synonymous with a murder trial watched around the world. a fall that began in the early hours of February 3, 2003, inside his Alhambra, California mansion. Spector, the architect of the famous Wall of Sound, had produced hits for artists like the Ronettes, the Beatles, and John Lennon, building a reputation as a genius whose eccentric behavior was tolerated and even mythologized for decades. On the night in question, Spector had been out drinking before bringing actress Lana Clarkson back to his home. Clarkson, 40 years old, had met Spector while working as a hostess at the House of Blues in West Hollywood, and witnesses later confirmed the two left together. What happened inside the mansion would become the center of one of the most bizarre and heavily scrutinized trials in celebrity crime history. Shortly after arriving home, Spector's driver made a 911 call reporting that a woman had been shot. Police arrived to find Clarkson slumped in a chair in the foyer, dead from a gunshot wound to the mouth. A revolver was found nearby, and Spector was present at the scene. According to testimony later given in court, Spector told his driver, "I think I killed somebody," a statement that would follow him for years. Spector maintained that Clarkson's death was a suicide, claiming she put the gun in her own mouth and pulled the trigger. Prosecutors rejected that explanation, arguing the physical evidence was inconsistent with self-inflicted harm and that Spector's long-standing fascination with firearms and control over women played a central role. The investigation uncovered a troubling pattern from Spector's past, including testimony from multiple women who said he had threatened them with guns during previous encounters, sometimes preventing them from leaving his home. These accounts were not initially charged as crimes but were introduced to establish a pattern of behavior that prosecutors argued escalated on the night Clarkson died. Spector was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, setting the stage for a trial that quickly became a media spectacle. When proceedings began in 2007, cameras captured Spector arriving in court wearing an ever-changing collection of wigs, each more elaborate than the last, reinforcing his image as an erratic and unpredictable figure. The trial itself was filled with technical disputes over forensic evidence, including blood spatter analysis that prosecutors said proved Clarkson was standing when she was shot, not seated as Spector claimed. Defense attorneys countered by attacking the credibility of expert witnesses and emphasizing inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. After months of testimony, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and on September 26, 2007, a mistrial was declared. The split jury reflected how divisive the case had become, with some jurors believing the evidence pointed clearly to murder while others felt reasonable doubt remained. Rather than walking free, Spector was immediately recharged, and prosecutors prepared for a second trial, refining their arguments and strengthening their forensic presentation. In 2009, a new jury heard the case, again focusing heavily on the physical evidence and Spector's prior conduct. This time, the outcome was different. Phil Spector was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years to life in prison, effectively ending any possibility of a return to public life. His conviction marked one of the rare instances in which a powerful entertainment figure was held criminally accountable for a violent crime, and it permanently reshaped how his musical legacy would be viewed. Once celebrated as a visionary producer, Spector became a cautionary example of how fame, wealth, and eccentricity can shield dangerous behavior for years without consequence. He remained incarcerated until his death in prison in 2021, leaving behind a legacy split between groundbreaking musical achievements and a single night that destroyed everything else. Number 3, Bart Whitaker. Bart Whitaker's crimes did not begin with violence. They began with lies. For years, Bart carefully constructed an image of success for his family, especially for his parents, Kent and Patricia Whitaker, who believed their son was thriving in college and preparing for a promising future. In reality, Bart had dropped out of Sam Houston State University after repeated academic failures. Instead of admitting the truth, he forged transcripts, staged phone calls, and maintained an elaborate deception designed to keep his family convinced that he was on track. As time passed, the pressure of maintaining the lie grew heavier. Bart feared exposure more than anything, convinced that admitting failure would permanently destroy how his parents saw him. That fear became the foundation for everything that followed. By late 2003, Bart's lies were on the verge of collapsing. His parents expected to attend his graduation ceremony, and Bart could no longer delay the moment of truth. Rather than confess, he made a decision that would end his family forever. Bart began contacting acquaintances, presenting himself as the victim of a wealthy family with large amounts of cash in their home. He pitched the idea of a robbery, carefully disguising it as an opportunity rather than a crime of murder. Behind the scenes, however, Bart was planning something far more calculated. He provided details about his parents' schedule, the layout of the house, and exactly when they would be arriving home. He made sure the timing placed everyone together, and he ensured that he would not be harmed during the attack. On the night of December 10, 2003, the Whitaker family went out to dinner to celebrate Bart's supposed graduation. Kent, Patricia, Bart, and Bart's younger brother Kevin returned home to their gated community in Sugar Land, Texas. As they unlocked the front door and stepped inside, gunmen opened fire. Patricia Whitaker was shot and killed almost immediately. Kevin was also fatally shot. Kent Whitaker was hit multiple times, but survived despite life-threatening injuries. Bart, standing nearby, was left completely unharmed. The attackers fled the scene, leaving behind devastation that initially appeared to be the result of a brutal home invasion. Police responded to what they believed was a robbery gone wrong. But from the very beginning, details did not add up. Bart Whitaker's lack of injuries stood out. His calm demeanor raised quiet suspicion. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in his statements about where he was standing and what he saw. As detectives began reconstructing the timeline, they uncovered the truth about Bart's academic history. Records showed he had not graduated, had not completed required courses, and had been lying to his parents for years. The celebration dinner, the supposed milestone, was completely fabricated. As the investigation deepened, evidence mounted rapidly. Phone records revealed communication between Bart and the men who carried out the attack. Financial evidence showed promises of payment. Witnesses testified that Bart had spoken openly about wanting his family dead. One of the hired gunmen eventually cooperated with authorities, describing in detail how Bart orchestrated the attack, provided instructions, and ensured he would be spared. The narrative of a robbery collapsed entirely, replaced by the reality of a son who had arranged the execution of his own family to protect a lie. Bart Whitaker was arrested and charged with capital murder. During the trial, prosecutors laid out a chilling portrait of premeditation. They emphasized that this was not a crime of passion or desperation in the heat of the moment. It was planned over weeks, rehearsed in conversations, and executed with precision. Bart had chosen the date, the setting, and the circumstances. He had weaponized trust, using his parents' pride and love as tools to bring them into harm's way. The jury heard testimony from Kent Whitaker, who described waking up after surgery to learn that his wife and son were dead and that the surviving son he trusted had arranged it all. In March 2007, Bart Whitaker was convicted of capital murder. The jury sentenced him to death. For most defendants, that verdict would mark the end of the story. But in this case, the most extraordinary development came from the man who had lost nearly everything. Kent Whitaker, the sole survivor of the attack, publicly forgave Bart. He stated repeatedly that he did not want his remaining son executed. Kent acknowledged the horror of Bart's actions but insisted that killing him would not bring peace or restore what was lost. Over the years, Kent became one of the most vocal advocates against Bart's execution, writing letters, speaking to officials, and pleading for clemency. Kent's forgiveness divided public opinion. Some saw it as an act of profound grace. Others viewed it as incomprehensible, given the scale of the betrayal. But Kent remained unwavering. He argued that justice did not require death, and that he could not endure losing another child, even one responsible for such unimaginable harm. His position became a central factor in Bart's fate. In 2018, after more than a decade on death row, Bart Whitaker's sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision spared his life, but ensured he would never be released. Bart was transferred out of death row to serve the remainder of his sentence in the Texas prison system. Kent Whitaker accepted the outcome as the only resolution he could live with, stating that it allowed him to grieve without carrying the additional burden of an execution. Bart Whitaker's case remains one of the most disturbing examples of familial betrayal in modern American crime. It was not driven by greed alone, nor by rage, but by fear of failure and the refusal to accept responsibility. A lie sustained too long became the justification for murder. The case continues to be studied as a stark reminder of how deception can escalate when accountability is avoided, and how violence can emerge not from chaos, but from careful planning hidden behind a facade of normalcy. Number 4. Hans Reiser. Hans Reiser's downfall began quietly, unfolding behind the image of a brilliant but difficult software engineer whose personal life was collapsing as his professional reputation deteriorated. Reiser was best known as the creator of Reiser FS, a file system once widely used in Linux distributions, and within technical circles, he had a reputation for intelligence paired with arrogance and volatility. By 2006, his marriage to Nina Reiser had completely broken down, devolving into a hostile separation marked by custody disputes, financial stress, and repeated conflicts over control. Nina, a Russian-born mother of 2, had grown increasingly fearful during the final months of her life, confiding to friends and acquaintances that Hans was stalking her and that exchanges involving their children made her uneasy. On September 3, 2006, Nina disappeared after leaving work in Oakland, California, intending to drop the children off with Hans. She never returned home, never contacted friends, and never accessed her bank accounts again. Almost immediately, attention focused on Reiser, not because of direct proof, but because of the circumstances surrounding their relationship and his behavior following her disappearance. When police located Nina's car, they found evidence that suggested violence rather than a voluntary disappearance, including bloodstains inside the vehicle that had been partially cleaned, damage consistent with a struggle, and personal items left behind that she would not have willingly abandoned. Reiser offered shifting explanations for the evening, initially claiming Nina had simply dropped off the children and left, but investigators noted inconsistencies in his timeline and demeanor. As the case developed, prosecutors began assembling a largely circumstantial case built on forensic findings, motive, and opportunity, arguing that Reiser had been enraged by the divorce, resentful of financial obligations, and desperate to maintain control over his children. Searches of his home and digital devices uncovered materials that prosecutors later emphasized at trial, including books related to violence and concealing crimes, which they argued showed planning rather than coincidence. The investigation gained national attention as Reiser's identity as a prominent software developer clashed sharply with the image of a man suspected of killing his wife. When the trial began in November 2007, it quickly became one of the most unusual courtroom spectacles of the decade. Reiser repeatedly clashed with his own defense team and ultimately chose to represent himself for portions of the proceedings, delivering rambling, combative arguments that alienated jurors and reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as controlling and unstable. Over the course of the 6-month trial, jurors heard detailed forensic testimony about blood patterns inside Nina's car, expert analysis suggesting the amount of blood present could not be explained by an accident, and evidence of Reiser's movements on the night Nina vanished. Without a body, the prosecution focused on showing that there was no reasonable scenario in which Nina could have disappeared voluntarily, emphasizing her close relationship with her children, her future plans, and her expressed fear of Hans. The defense attempted to undermine the forensic evidence and suggested alternative explanations, but the cumulative weight of the case proved overwhelming. In April 2008, the jury found Hans Reiser guilty of first-degree murder, a verdict that stunned many in the technology community and permanently erased his professional legacy. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Even after conviction, Reiser continued to proclaim his innocence, filing appeals and issuing statements accusing prosecutors, judges, and even his own attorneys of corruption and conspiracy. For years, Nina Reiser's body remained missing, leaving her family without closure and fueling continued public interest in the case. In 2012, facing the reality that he would likely die in prison, Reiser reversed course. In a calculated legal move, he agreed to lead authorities to Nina's remains in exchange for a reduction of his conviction from first-degree to second-degree murder. He directed investigators to a shallow grave near his former home, where Nina's body was recovered, confirming that she had been killed shortly after her disappearance. The discovery brought long-delayed confirmation to what prosecutors had argued from the beginning and ended years of speculation about her fate. Despite the reduced conviction, Reiser's sentence remained effectively lifelong, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. The case closed a grim chapter defined by control, resentment, and obsession, transforming Hans Reiser from a celebrated innovator into a convicted murderer whose name is now remembered not for his contributions to technology, but for a crime that destroyed a family and exposed the darker side of brilliance unchecked by accountability. Number 5. Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander Pichushkin's crimes unfolded over years in plain sight, centered around a quiet stretch of green space in southern Moscow known as Bitsa Park, a place where joggers, families, and pensioners passed through daily without realizing it had become the hunting ground for one of Russia's most prolific serial killers. Born in 1974, Pichushkin grew up with a troubled childhood marked by social isolation and resentment, and by his own later admissions, he developed violent fantasies at a young age. In the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia entered a period of economic chaos, Pichushkin's life failed to stabilize. He drifted between short-term jobs, struggled to form lasting relationships, and fixated on a desire to kill that he later described not as anger or revenge, but as a compulsion. His first confirmed murder occurred in 1992 when he lured an acquaintance to Bitsa Park and killed him, a crime that went largely unnoticed amid the surge of violent crime sweeping Russia at the time. Instead of being deterred, Pichushkin felt emboldened. Over the next decade, he returned to the same park repeatedly, refining his method and selecting victims who would attract minimal attention, often targeting elderly men, homeless individuals, alcoholics, and people he believed would not be immediately missed. He would befriend them, offer drinks, and walk with them into quieter sections of the park before killing them, disposing of the bodies in sewer shafts, wooded areas, or shallow graves. What distinguished Pichushkin from many serial killers was not just the volume of his crimes, but the structure he imposed on them. Inside his apartment, he kept a chessboard and marked each kill as a square, later telling investigators that his goal was to fill all 64 squares, treating murder as a form of grim progression rather than an emotional act. As bodies accumulated, Moscow police investigated individual deaths but failed to connect them into a single series. Many victims were found intoxicated, injured, or deceased in circumstances that could be attributed to accidents or alcohol-related incidents, allowing Pichushkin to continue operating with little interference. During this time, he lived with his mother, maintained a largely unremarkable public existence, and attracted no serious law enforcement attention. In interviews after his arrest, Pichushkin stated that killing gave his life meaning, famously saying that life without murder was like life without food, a remark that underscored the depth of his detachment and the ritualized nature of his violence. By the early 2000s, the number of bodies linked to Bitsa Park began to raise alarm, and investigators started to suspect a serial offender. Still, progress was slow, hampered by limited forensic resources, inconsistent victim records, and the sheer scale of urban Moscow. The case finally broke in 2006, not through advanced forensic science, but through human error on the part of the killer. One intended victim survived an attack and was able to provide police with a description of the man who assaulted him. Around the same time, Pichushkin made a critical mistake by confiding in a co-worker, telling her about his murders, and even claiming a higher number of victims than police suspected. The co-worker reported the conversation to authorities, and investigators quickly connected the dots. Pichushkin was arrested in June 2006, and during interrogation, he confessed with little hesitation. Unlike many serial killers who minimize their actions, Pichushkin was openly cooperative, calmly describing how he selected victims, how many he had killed, and where some of the bodies were located. He initially claimed responsibility for more than 60 murders, insisting that police had not yet uncovered the full extent of his crimes. Investigators were able to verify 48 murders, with Pichushkin formally charged with 51 counts. The trial began in 2007 and drew intense media coverage across Russia, both for the sheer scale of the crimes and for Pichushkin's demeanor. In court, he appeared emotionless and unapologetic, speaking about the murders in a flat, matter-of-fact tone that unsettled observers. Prosecutors presented extensive testimony linking him to the victims, including witness statements, recovered remains, and his own detailed confessions. The chessboard found in his apartment became a central symbol of the case, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that the killings were methodical and premeditated rather than impulsive acts of violence. In October 2007, Alexander Pichushkin was convicted of 48 murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Russian history. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the harshest penalty available under Russian law following the abolition of the death penalty. During sentencing, Pichushkin showed no remorse and reiterated that he believed he could have killed more people if he had not been stopped. He was transferred to a high-security penal colony designed for Russia's most dangerous offenders, where inmates are held in extreme isolation. The case sent shockwaves through Moscow, prompting renewed scrutiny of unsolved deaths, public safety in urban parks, and the vulnerabilities of marginalized populations. For years, Pichushkin had exploited social invisibility, targeting those whose disappearances blended into the background of a city struggling with post-Soviet instability. His arrest forced authorities to confront how easily repeated violence could be overlooked when victims lacked advocates and crimes were fragmented across time and jurisdictions. Today, Alexander Pichushkin remains incarcerated under strict conditions, his chessboard unfinished, his crimes standing as a chilling example of how obsession, routine, and indifference can combine to allow extreme violence to persist unchecked in the heart of a major city. Number 6. Robert Pickton. Robert William Pickton's crimes unfolded over years in British Columbia, hidden behind the image of a reclusive pig farmer whose property sat on the outskirts of Port Coquitlam, an area long associated with poverty, addiction, and missing women. Born in 1949, Picton grew up on a rundown family farm alongside his brother David, raised under strict conditions by parents who ran the property as both a working farm and a slaughterhouse. From an early age, Robert lived a largely isolated life, performing manual labor, avoiding close relationships, and developing a reputation as socially awkward and emotionally detached. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Picton farm had become a gathering place for sex workers, drug users, and transient individuals, many of whom were struggling to survive in Vancouver's downtown east side. That neighborhood was already plagued by crime and neglect, and when women began disappearing from the area, their cases often received little urgency from authorities. Throughout the 1990s, dozens of women vanished from Vancouver's streets. Families reported them missing, advocates raised alarms, and rumors circulated about a serial killer targeting vulnerable women. Despite mounting concern, investigations stalled repeatedly. Jurisdictional confusion, limited resources, and systemic bias toward victims involved in sex work allowed the disappearances to be minimized or dismissed as voluntary. During this time, Picton continued operating his farm, hosting parties, socializing with people from the downtown east side, and offering rides, food, or drugs. Many of the women who later disappeared were last seen entering vehicles or properties linked to Picton, but no single piece of evidence was enough to trigger a full-scale investigation. Law enforcement had early opportunities to stop him. In 1997, Picton survived an attempted murder by a woman who stabbed him during a confrontation at the farm. She was later charged, while Picton faced minimal scrutiny despite the circumstances. In 1999, police executed a search warrant at the farm related to illegal firearms, but the operation was limited in scope and critical evidence was overlooked. These missed chances would later become central to public outrage as the scale of Picton's crimes became clear. The case finally broke in 2002 when police conducted a more extensive search of the Picton farm, initially focusing on weapons violations. What they found transformed the investigation entirely. Forensic teams uncovered personal belongings belonging to missing women, including identification cards, clothing, and jewelry. Even more disturbing, DNA evidence linked Picton directly to multiple victims. The farm itself became one of the largest and most complex crime scenes in Canadian history, requiring months of excavation and analysis. Investigators recovered human remains mixed with animal remains, making identification slow and emotionally devastating for families waiting for answers. The conditions on the property, combined with years of decomposition, complicated forensic work, but the evidence that emerged was overwhelming. Picton was arrested in February 2002 and charged with multiple counts of murder. As the investigation continued, the number of charges grew, eventually reaching 26 counts of first-degree murder. Authorities suspected the true number of victims was much higher, possibly as many as 49, based on DNA fragments and witness statements. During interrogation, Picton made chilling statements to an undercover officer posing as a fellow inmate, casually discussing his killings and suggesting he had wanted to reach an even higher body count. These recordings became key evidence, revealing a lack of remorse and a disturbing sense of pride in his actions. The legal process that followed was long and highly scrutinized. Prosecutors ultimately decided to try Picton first on a smaller number of charges to ensure a manageable case and increase the likelihood of conviction. In 2007, Robert Picton went to trial on 6 counts of second-degree murder. The courtroom proceedings laid bare years of investigative failures, highlighting how warnings from families and community advocates had gone unheeded. Jurors heard detailed forensic testimony, recordings of Picton's own statements, and evidence showing how victims' belongings were found throughout his property. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of witnesses and the interpretation of forensic findings, but the volume and consistency of evidence proved decisive. In December 2007, the jury found Robert Picton guilty on all 6 counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence available under Canadian law. Although convicted of only 6 murders, the court acknowledged that Picton was responsible for far more deaths than those formerly tried. The remaining charges were stayed, a decision that sparked anger and frustration among victims' families, many of whom felt justice had only been partially served. The aftermath of the Picton case forced Canada to confront deep systemic failures. Public inquiries revealed that police had repeatedly underestimated the seriousness of the disappearances and failed to act decisively despite clear warning signs. The victims, many of whom were Indigenous women, sex workers, or living in extreme poverty, had been treated as disposable by institutions meant to protect them. The case became a catalyst for broader discussions about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, police accountability, and how marginalized communities are treated within the justice system. Robert Picton spent the remainder of his life in prison, largely silent, rarely speaking publicly after his conviction. In 2024, he died following an assault by another inmate, closing the chapter on one of Canada's most notorious serial murder cases. His death did not bring closure for many families, but his conviction ensured that the man responsible for years of terror could no longer harm anyone else. The Picton case remains a defining moment in Canadian criminal history, not only because of the scale of the murders, but because of what it revealed about neglect, indifference, and the catastrophic consequences of ignoring early warning signs. It stands as a stark reminder that extreme violence often flourishes where society looks away, and that justice delayed can mean lives lost long before accountability finally arrives. Number 7. Michael Devlin. Michael Devlin's crimes shocked the United States, not because they were flashy or sudden, but because they revealed how easily a determined offender could exploit gaps in oversight, trust, and institutional coordination for years without being stopped. Devlin lived an outwardly ordinary life in the Midwest, holding jobs that allowed him access to children and moving frequently enough to avoid sustained scrutiny. Beneath that surface, he was systematically abducting boys, transporting them across state lines, and holding them in secret while presenting himself to the outside world as a quiet, unremarkable adult. His crimes spanned from 2002 to 2007, a 5-year period during which multiple warning signs went undetected or unconnected. The case first gained national attention in October 2002, when 11-year-old Sean Hornbeck disappeared while riding his bicycle near his home in Richwoods, Missouri. The abduction occurred in broad daylight, yet produced few usable leads. Despite an intensive search, no credible suspect was identified, and as months turned into years, Sean's disappearance became one of the most haunting missing child cases in the region. What investigators did not know was that Sean was alive, being held captive by Devlin, who had taken him hundreds of miles away and forced him to assume a new identity. Devlin enrolled Sean in school under a false name, coached him on how to behave, and maintained strict control while managing to avoid detection by teachers, neighbors, and authorities. The fact that a missing child could be integrated into daily life without triggering alarms would later become one of the most troubling aspects of the case. For more than 4 years, Sean remained hidden in plain sight. During that time, Devlin continued moving between states, using forged documents and false stories to explain the presence of a child who was not his. The failure was not a single mistake, but a chain of missed opportunities across jurisdictions. There was no centralized system capable of flagging inconsistencies in school enrollment, housing records, or identification claims. Devlin exploited those gaps deliberately, creating just enough normalcy to avoid deeper scrutiny. The case broke open on January 11, 2007, when Devlin abducted another child, 13-year-old Ben Ownby, from a neighborhood in Kirkwood, Missouri. Unlike the earlier abduction, this crime triggered an immediate and massive response. Surveillance footage captured Devlin's vehicle, and witnesses provided usable descriptions. Within days, police identified Devlin as a suspect. On January 17, 2007, law enforcement surrounded his apartment complex in Kirkwood. When Devlin exited the building, he was taken into custody without incident. What officers found inside the apartment would redefine the investigation entirely. Ben Ownby was recovered alive, and in a back room, police discovered Sean Hornbeck missing for more than 4 years. The revelation stunned the country. A child who had been presumed either dead or permanently lost was suddenly found alive, walking out of captivity. The case instantly shifted from a kidnapping investigation to a multi-state federal prosecution. Devlin was charged with numerous offenses, including kidnapping, transporting minors across state lines, and related federal crimes. As investigators examined his history, they uncovered extensive evidence showing that Devlin had carefully planned his actions, maintained false identities, and taken deliberate steps to avoid detection. The scope of the case expanded rapidly, revealing a pattern of predatory behavior rather than isolated incidents. In October 2007, Michael Devlin pleaded guilty to federal charges. The plea agreement spared the victims from a prolonged trial and allowed prosecutors to present a comprehensive account of Devlin's actions, without subjecting the children to repeated testimony. In court, Devlin offered little explanation beyond acknowledging his guilt. The judge sentenced him to 74 life sentences, ensuring that he would never be released. The sentence reflected not only the severity of the crimes, but the sustained, calculated nature of Devlin's conduct over many years. The legal outcome, however, did not end public scrutiny. The case triggered widespread examination of how such prolonged captivity could occur without intervention. Questions were raised about school systems that accepted questionable guardianship claims, housing authorities that did not verify identities, and the lack of coordination between missing persons databases across state lines. Sean Hornbeck's recovery was celebrated as a miracle, but it also exposed systemic vulnerabilities that allowed his disappearance to go unresolved for so long. Lawmakers and advocacy groups cited the case when pushing for improved data sharing, stronger verification requirements, and greater awareness of how abducted children can be hidden under assumed identities. Sean Hornbeck and Ben Ownby faced the difficult process of rebuilding their lives under intense media attention. Both families emphasized the importance of privacy and healing, while the public struggled to reconcile the relief of recovery with the horror of what had been endured. Authorities were careful to limit the public release of details, focusing instead on the legal resolution and the broader lessons of the case. Devlin was transferred into the federal prison system, where he remains incarcerated under conditions designed for high-risk offenders. Michael Devlin's case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of long-term abduction in modern American criminal history, not because of spectacle, but because of how methodical and sustained the crimes were. He did not rely on chaos or opportunity alone. He relied on patience, planning, and the assumption that no single institution would see the full picture. His eventual capture came not from chance, but from a second crime that generated immediate attention and coordination, highlighting the contrast between fragmented responses and unified action. Today, Devlin remains imprisoned for life. His name permanently associated with one of the rare cases in which a missing child was found alive years after disappearance. The case continues to be cited in law enforcement training, child protection policy discussions, and analyses of interagency failure. It serves as a stark reminder that prolonged crimes often persist not because they are invisible, but because responsibility is divided, information is siloed, and early warning signs are not treated with the urgency they demand. Number 8. Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin's crimes spanned decades, countries, and identities, hidden behind a shifting series of jobs, addresses, and false names that allowed him to disappear whenever suspicion began to form. By the time he was convicted in 2007, Tobin had already lived several lives, each one leaving behind fragments of violence that would not be fully connected until years later. His case did not unfold as a single investigation, but as a slow reconstruction of buried crimes, reopened cold cases, and evidence unearthed from places he once called home. Tobin was born in 1946 in Johnstone, Scotland, and spent much of his early life moving between Scotland and England. He developed a long criminal history that included theft, assault, and sexual offenses, often targeting vulnerable women. Over time, he became adept at reinventing himself, using aliases, short-term employment, and frequent relocations to stay ahead of scrutiny. By the early 2000s, Tobin had settled intermittently in Glasgow, working in low-profile jobs and attending church regularly, cultivating an image of quiet religiosity that masked his past. The case that finally exposed Tobin began in September 2006, when 23-year-old Angelika Kluk, a Polish student living in Glasgow, went missing. Kluk had been volunteering at St. Patrick's Church, where Tobin was employed as a handyman. She was last seen entering the church to clean, after which all contact stopped. When she failed to return home, friends reported her missing, and police began searching locations connected to her daily routine. Suspicion quickly focused on the church, particularly after inconsistencies emerged in Tobin's account of when he last saw her. During a search of the church basement, investigators discovered Angelika Kluk's body concealed beneath floorboards. Evidence showed she had been restrained and killed inside the building. The discovery shocked the local community and immediately placed Tobin at the center of the investigation. He was arrested and charged with murder, and in 2007 he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 21 years. At the time, the conviction appeared to resolve a single tragic crime. But for investigators, it raised a much larger question. As Tobin's background was re-examined, authorities uncovered a long trail of unexplained movements, past convictions, and suspicious gaps in his history. Detectives began reviewing cold cases from areas where Tobin had lived or worked, particularly unsolved disappearances of young women in the early 1990s. One case quickly resurfaced: the 1991 disappearance of 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton from Bathgate, Scotland. Vicky had vanished after leaving her home to attend a local fair, and despite extensive searches, no trace of her had ever been found. Investigators discovered that Tobin had lived in Bathgate at the time of Vicky Hamilton's disappearance. When police searched a former residence linked to Tobin, they made a grim discovery. Human remains were found buried in the garden. Forensic testing confirmed they belonged to Vicky Hamilton. The location of the body, combined with Tobin's presence in the area at the time, directly linked him to the crime. Further investigation led police to another former address associated with Tobin, this time in Margate, England. There, officers uncovered the remains of another teenage girl, 14-year-old Dinah McNichol, who had disappeared in 1991 while hitchhiking. Tobin had been living in Margate during the period of her disappearance as well. The discovery confirmed that Tobin's violence was not isolated or recent, but part of a pattern that stretched back decades. In 2009, Tobin was convicted of the murders of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. His sentence was upgraded to a whole life order, meaning he would never be eligible for parole. The court described him as a continuing danger with no prospect of rehabilitation. The convictions placed Tobin among the most notorious serial killers in British history. As details of his past emerged, speculation grew that Tobin may have been responsible for additional unsolved crimes, including other disappearances in the UK and potentially abroad. Some investigators examined possible links to cases dating back to the 1970s, though no further charges were brought. The scale of his movements, combined with his long history of violence, left open the possibility that not all of his victims were ever identified. What made Tobin particularly difficult to detect for so long was his ability to exploit social invisibility. He targeted young women, often in transitional moments of their lives, and operated in different jurisdictions that did not easily share information at the time. Each move allowed him to reset his identity and leave behind unresolved questions. His attendance at church and outward displays of faith added another layer of concealment, deflecting suspicion even as he embedded himself in community spaces. The impact of the case extended beyond Tobin himself. It prompted renewed scrutiny of how offenders with extensive criminal histories were monitored, particularly when moving between regions or countries. It also raised questions about missed warning signs and whether earlier intervention could have prevented later murders. Families of victims were left to grapple with the knowledge that answers had come only after decades of uncertainty. Peter Tobin remained imprisoned under a whole life order, held in high-security facilities and largely isolated from the public. In 2022, he died in custody at the age of 76. His death closed the legal chapter of the case, but did not fully resolve the questions surrounding the full extent of his crimes. For investigators, Tobin became a symbol of how serial offenders can operate across time and geography, exploiting gaps in oversight and record-keeping to evade justice. Today, Peter Tobin is remembered not only for the murders he was convicted of, but for the long shadow of suspicion that followed him. His case stands as a stark example of how buried crimes can remain hidden for years, waiting for a single investigation to unravel a lifetime of violence that had been concealed behind ordinary routines, borrowed identities, and constant movement. Number 9. Joseph Edward Duncan III. Joseph Edward Duncan III was already a known danger long before the crime that finally brought him national attention. Yet repeated failures within the criminal justice system allowed him to remain free until the consequences became catastrophic. His case stands as one of the clearest examples of how warning signs, prior convictions, and institutional breakdowns can converge to produce irreversible outcomes. By the time Duncan was captured in 2005 and sentenced in 2007, his criminal history spanned multiple states, decades of offenses, and a pattern of escalating violence that had never been meaningfully interrupted. Duncan was born in 1963 and spent much of his adult life cycling through prisons, parole, and supervision for sexual offenses involving minors. His record included convictions dating back to the 1980s and 1990s, with repeated violations of parole and probation conditions. Despite being classified as a high-risk offender, Duncan was repeatedly released back into the community, often with limited monitoring and inconsistent information sharing between states. By the early 2000s, he was living a transient existence, moving frequently, using aliases, and positioning himself near families and children without attracting immediate attention from authorities. The crime that exposed Duncan occurred in May 2005 in northern Idaho. members of the Groene family were attacked in their home, and 3 family members were killed. 2 children were taken from the residence and transported out of state. The brutality of the crime triggered an immediate multi-agency response, including local law enforcement, state police, and federal authorities. Within days, the case became a national priority, not only because of the severity of the crime, but because of the urgent need to locate the missing children. As investigators worked to identify a suspect, they uncovered Duncan's presence in the region and his extensive criminal background. Evidence quickly tied him to the crime scene, and a nationwide search was launched. Duncan, meanwhile, moved across state lines, traveling through remote areas and avoiding major highways. The manhunt lasted several weeks and involved tips from the public, coordinated surveillance efforts, and the use of national alert systems. The case drew widespread media coverage, with images of the missing children broadcast continuously across the country. The break came in July 2005, when a restaurant employee in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, recognized Duncan and one of the children from a widely circulated composite sketch and alert. Law enforcement was notified immediately. Officers arrived at the location and took Duncan into custody without resistance. One of the children was recovered alive at the scene. The arrest marked the end of the manhunt and the beginning of a complex federal prosecution that would span years. Following his arrest, Duncan was charged with multiple federal crimes, including kidnapping, transporting minors across state lines, and murder. Investigators also re-examined his past, uncovering evidence that linked him to additional unsolved crimes from the 1990s. Duncan ultimately confessed to several earlier murders, further expanding the scope of his criminal responsibility. The federal government pursued the case aggressively, citing both the severity of the offenses and Duncan's long history of violent behavior as justification for seeking the maximum possible penalties. The legal process moved forward with an emphasis on minimizing further harm to surviving victims and their families. In December 2007, Joseph Edward Duncan III pleaded guilty to federal charges. The plea eliminated the need for a prolonged trial and allowed prosecutors to present a comprehensive account of his crimes without extended courtroom proceedings. During sentencing, the court reviewed Duncan's criminal record in detail, noting the repeated opportunities for intervention that had failed to prevent the final outcome. The judge imposed a sentence of death, along with multiple consecutive life sentences, ensuring that Duncan would never be released under any circumstances. Duncan was transferred to federal death row, where he remained for years as appeals proceeded through the courts. Throughout that time, the case continued to influence discussions about offender monitoring, parole decision-making, and interagency communication. Lawmakers and criminal justice experts pointed to Duncan's history as evidence of systemic weaknesses, particularly the lack of consistent tracking for high-risk offenders moving between states. His case became a reference point in debates over sentencing reform, supervision standards, and the balance between rehabilitation and public safety. While incarcerated, Duncan was diagnosed with brain cancer. His health deteriorated rapidly, and in 2021, he died in custody before his execution could be carried out. His death closed the legal chapter of the case, but did little to resolve the broader questions it raised. For many, the focus shifted from Duncan himself to the failures that allowed him to continue offending despite clear indicators of danger. The long-term impact of the case extended beyond the courtroom. It prompted reviews of parole practices, improvements in information sharing between jurisdictions, and renewed emphasis on monitoring individuals with extensive histories of violent crime. Advocacy groups cited the case when arguing for stronger safeguards and accountability measures within the criminal justice system. For law enforcement, it became a sobering example of how even well-documented offenders can exploit gaps when systems operate in isolation rather than coordination. Joseph Edward Duncan III is remembered not just for the crimes he committed, but for what his case revealed about the consequences of fragmented oversight. His criminal trajectory showed how repeated failures to intervene can allow risk to compound over time, turning known threats into national tragedies. While his conviction and sentence ensured he could no longer harm anyone, the case continues to be studied as a warning about the cost of ignoring patterns, underestimating danger, and assuming that prior convictions alone are enough to protect the public without sustained, coordinated enforcement. Number 10. Dr. Martin McNeil. Dr. Martin McNeil projected the image of success, discipline, and authority for decades, building a life that blended professional status with religious respectability while concealing a pattern of deception that would ultimately culminate in murder. McNeil was a licensed physician, a trained attorney, and a former bishop in the LDS Church, roles that gave him credibility and influence within his community. He lived in Utah with his wife, Michelle McNeil, a former beauty queen and devoted mother of 8 children, and outwardly their family appeared stable and prosperous. Behind closed doors, however, the marriage was deteriorating. Financial problems, infidelity, and manipulation had become constants, and by the mid-2000s, Michelle had grown increasingly concerned about her husband's behavior, particularly his controlling tendencies and secretive relationships with younger women. In early 2007, McNeil convinced Michelle to undergo a cosmetic facelift, presenting it as a routine procedure despite concerns raised by others about her health and the necessity of the surgery. The operation was performed in April 2007, and although Michelle returned home to recover, she experienced complications almost immediately. McNeil took control of her post-operative care, prescribing a combination of medications that included Valium, Ambien, Percocet, and Lortab, a dangerous cocktail that left her heavily sedated and disoriented. On April 11, 2007, Michelle was found unresponsive in the bathtub of their home. McNeil claimed she had accidentally drowned, stating that she must have fallen while bathing. Authorities initially accepted this explanation, and Michelle's death was ruled accidental. What followed raised immediate alarm among Michelle's daughters. Within weeks of her death, McNeil moved his mistress, Gypsy Willis, a much younger woman, into the family home, introducing her to the children as a nanny. The speed of the transition shocked relatives and friends, reinforcing long-held suspicions that McNeil had been involved in an extramarital relationship long before Michelle's death. As the family processed their grief, Michelle's daughters began reviewing medical records and circumstances surrounding the surgery and recovery. They discovered that McNeil had a history of professional misconduct, including past allegations of inappropriate relationships with patients and the loss of his medical license in another state. These findings deepened their belief that their mother's death had not been an accident. Despite these concerns, local authorities initially declined to reopen the case, citing the medical examiner's ruling. Unwilling to accept that conclusion, Michelle's daughters embarked on a years-long effort to push for a renewed investigation. They consulted independent experts, gathered documentation, and persistently contacted law enforcement and prosecutors. Over time, their efforts began to gain traction. Medical professionals reviewing the case questioned the amount and combination of drugs prescribed to Michelle, noting that the medications could have rendered her incapable of protecting herself in water. Additional scrutiny revealed that McNeil had researched drowning deaths and had been present during the critical moments before Michelle was found unresponsive. As the investigation reopened, prosecutors built a case focused on medical evidence, motive, and McNeil's conduct before and after Michelle's death. They argued that he had deliberately overmedicated her, knowing it would leave her vulnerable, and then drowned her in the bathtub to stage an accidental death. Financial motive also emerged as a key factor. Michelle's death freed McNeil from a marriage he wanted to escape and removed obstacles to his relationship with Gypsy Willis. It also affected insurance policies and financial obligations that had been straining him for years. In 2013, more than 6 years after Michelle's death, Martin McNeil was formally charged with murder. The trial brought intense public attention, not only because of the allegations, but because of McNeil's background as a doctor and former religious leader. Jurors heard testimony from medical experts who explained how the prescribed drugs could suppress reflexes and consciousness, making accidental drowning unlikely. They also heard from family members who described Michelle's fears and McNeil's controlling behavior, painting a portrait of a man who carefully managed appearances while manipulating those around him. The defense attempted to argue that Michelle's death was a tragic accident and that McNeil's personal conduct, while morally questionable, did not prove murder. Prosecutors countered by emphasizing the pattern of deception, the timing of events, and McNeil's medical knowledge, arguing that he understood exactly how the drugs would affect Michelle's body. The case ultimately hinged on whether the jury believed the death could reasonably be accidental given the circumstances. In November 2013, Martin McNeil was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict validated the years-long fight led by Michelle's daughters, whose persistence transformed a closed case into a murder conviction. The courtroom reaction reflected both relief and grief as the family finally received official acknowledgement that Michelle's death had been the result of a crime. The case did not end there. In 2017, while serving his life sentence, McNeil died by suicide in prison. His death closed the legal process, but left lasting impact on those affected by his actions. The case became widely cited in discussions about domestic homicide, medical authority, and how professional status can be used to obscure criminal behavior. It also highlighted the critical role families can play when official systems fail to act, demonstrating how persistence and documentation can force accountability even years after a crime. Dr. Martin McNeil's story remains one of the most chilling examples of betrayal hidden behind respectability. A man entrusted with healing and leadership used his knowledge and authority to orchestrate a death that was initially dismissed as an accident. His conviction reshaped how similar cases are evaluated and stands as a reminder that crimes committed within private spaces, especially by those with expertise and influence, often require extraordinary effort to uncover.